when this family started their vacation, they had no idea that it would turn out like this. It all started with a simple family picture on the very first day. But this picture was far from simple because it accidentally also captured something in the background. And when they saw what, it gave them goosebumps. Family takes vacation photo. They got goosebumps when they look back at this one. It was their first big vacation as a family. They visited the local bed at breakfast a couple of times before, but as a family, they never experienced a trip like this. The untamed wilderness of these mountains was their destination, and the sight of the massive rock formations made this family gasp in amazement. They planned a short hike through the woodland area of their trip. It was just meant to scout the area and maybe snap a picture or two, and that was exactly what they did. Arriving at a quiet spot above the forest floor, Carl decided that this spot was perfect for their first family picture. He placed the camera on a boulder in front of them and put the device on self-timer. After that, he positioned himself next to his family and waited for the camera to say click. Eager to see the outcome of the photo, he rushed towards the camera, not knowing that this photo would shock him. Carl picked up the camera from its rocky plateau and inspected what it had captured. He expected beautiful scenery in his content family in the foreground, but the camera captured way more than that. He looked at the screen and instantly turned pale. "Honey, come over here quick," he shouted towards his wife. Debbie got nervous because of her husband's panicked request and ran over to Carl as fast as she could. Carl pointed out at the camera screen and asked if she saw it too. It was a small detail and wanted to make sure that he wasn't going crazy, but Debbie saw it too. Nervousness increased as both parents clutched the camera firmly in their hands. They zoomed in on the background of the picture, and what they then saw gave them goosebumps instantly. Behind Debbie's head, a huge object hung from the mountainside. It definitely wasn't supposed to be there, but what was it? Both parents then looked up from the camera and turned their gaze toward the mountains. They squinted their eyes trying to identify the large object. It was hard to recognize at first, but it didn't take long for the object to get their undivided attention. Because out of the blue, they heard a deafening scream. Panic sank in because the scream they heard was coming from the source they captured in their photo. At this point, they couldn't just sit idly by and do nothing. "We have to go over there, honey. This can go horribly wrong as we don't act quickly," Carl said to his wife. Debbie agreed. They walked towards their children, and while Debbie held them close to her chest, Carl grabbed his phone to make an all-important call, but there was one big problem with this plan, because there seemed to be zero cell phone services in this part of the Rocky Mountains. "What do we do now?" Debbie asked Carl with a shivering voice. They both agreed that they could do nothing when staying here, so they packed up their gear, grabbed the children, and rushed over to the car. "We have to get closer. Maybe there is service down there," Carl suggested. As they stepped into the car, the race against time could begin. The drive towards the mountain wall was a tough one. The forest floor lay between them and their objective, and the terrain there was rugged. Large, dense pine trees and uneven ground made it difficult for the car to navigate through. But even though the journey was a harsh one, this family of four knew that they had to try and make it. Carl kept increasing speed as he rushed his family sedan through the forest floor. It was a bold move, which almost made him hit some pine trees a couple of times. While Carl was bussing navigating the dense forest, Debbie made sure to do her part as well. She constantly hung her arm out of the window, holding her phone upwards in the hope of getting some cell service that way. "You getting something?" Carl asked in a desperate voice. Deborah reluctantly shook her head. "Sorry, honey. I'm not receiving anything at the moment." She kept trying, though, hoping that their luck would change, and then out of the blue it did. Not because Debbie received a signal, but because one of the children spotted something between the trees. Frantically, their oldest child yelled. Debbie turned her head and saw that her son was pointing at something in the distance. It was hard to see at first, but after focusing, Debbie saw it too. There was a small wooden cabin in the middle of the forest. "Maybe they have a phone." Debbie instructed her husband to drive towards the cabin as quickly as he could, and Carl reacted accordingly. With the directions of his wife, Carl had made it to the cabin. He parked the car on the side of the building and ran towards the front door, hoping that somebody was home. Inside the cabin, Carl saw an old, musky interior, wooden furniture and curtains that looked like they came straight out of a 50s movie. But the most important thing he saw was a bowl of soup on the diner table. It was still piping hot, so that meant that somebody was home. Carl put his hands on the side of his mouth and started yelling, "Hello, hello, ooh. Is there anybody in here? We need your help." The room remained empty and silent for a minute. But shortly after, an elderly lady came walking around the corner. "Hello, good sir, how may I help you?" Carl introduced himself quickly, but didn't have much time for a long introduction. He came straight to the point and asked the woman if he could borrow her phone. He had to make an urgent call and time was of the essence. The woman nodded at Carl and pointed towards her landline. He asked the woman if she knew the number of local emergency services. "Well, yes, of course. It's in the laminated map next to the phone," she said. Carl ran his finger across the sheet and found what he was looking for. It was time to call for help. "What's wrong?" the lady asked. While the phone rang, Carl explained the dire situation on the mountain wall. He could see the growing fear in the old woman's eyes, and she thanked him for his quick thinking. After that short explanation, the operator of the emergency services answered. Carl again explained the situation at hand, but there was a problem. The emergency operator told Carl that the rugged terrain and the rough winds made it impossible for their helicopter to reach their location. There was only one option. They had to send a mobile car unit to the maintained wall, and it would take well over 30 minutes to get there. This posed a problem because even though Carl was happy that help could be offered, he knew that 30 minutes could be way too late for the situation at hand. That's when the young father realized that he had to put on a brave face and act himself. It was time to go. He asked the emergency services to send their mobile unit anyway, but also said that he could not wait for them to arrive. He would meet them by the mountain wall, but set out to save the day himself. He only hoped that he would reach the dire situation in time. Debbie and the kids were waiting for Carl by the entrance of the cabin, hoping for good news, but Carl couldn't give them what they were hoping for. He asked them to stay with the old lady. Here they would be safe from danger as he himself set out on a treacherous path. Debbie reluctantly agreed with her husband's proposal and stayed behind with the kids. After that, Carl jumped into his car again and traversed through the remaining forest floor to reach the mountainside. And it was a good thing that he sprung into action that quickly, because within minutes, he heard the screams again. The volume of the screams intensified as Carl reached the mountain wall. He looked upwards and almost started crying when he saw the situation above him. He had to get up there quickly, but luckily he spotted a small mountain path upwards to his left. Now, the really dangerous part commenced. To actually reach the source of the screams, Carl had to climb up the mountain at least 120 feet. The path he was on would take him there. It zigzagged up the mountainside, but the path was treacherous. Loose boulders came tumbling down every few minutes as he shimmied up the steep wall. Carl was risking his own life getting up the steep cliff. He looked downwards a couple of times, saw the forest floor getting further and further away from him, but he had to continue, and eventually he came close enough to see his end goal. The situation was even worse than he thought. Carl held onto a sturdy-looking rock and squinted his eyes. A large black and white sphere hung on the side of the mountain wall. It moved with the wind, forming weird shapes as the breeze caught its canvas-like structure. "What the hell is that thing?" Carl spoke out loud. Shortly after that, Carl's question would be answered when a particularly harsh wind found its way under one of the canvas flaps. It blew the sheet open and made the image clear as day. It was a large paragliding chute that hung on the wall of the mountain. And that wasn't all. The wind was really picking up and now blew the chute harshly from side to side. Eventually, it folded open, revealing the paraglider himself inside of the contraption. The lines were tangled around the individual, and the paraglider hung on the side of the cliff motionless. Is he still alive? Carl yelled at the motionless man in his paragliding gear. At first, there was no response. But after a second shout, Carl saw the man's face move in his direction. The man started screaming and asked Carl to help him. "Please come over quickly. I don't know how much longer I can keep up." Carl was happy that the man was still alive, but it was clear that he fell in and out of consciousness. Carl slowly crawled toward the entangled glider. He had to be careful not to fall himself, but by pushing his fear aside, he eventually reached a ledge above the desperate man. It was now close enough for the desperate glider to actually speak to him. He hoped that the glider was conscious enough for him to notice Carl's arrival. The brave father started speaking to the man, and luckily he got a response. The glider told Carl that all of this madness started with the wind. The glider had made this jump many times before without any trouble, but the winds today were unpredictable. The very first seconds downwards seemed to go without any problem. But then a heavy wind came out of nowhere and smacked the man against the mountain wall. "And there is another problem," the glider said. The slam against the side of the mountain wall had broken the glider's leg. That fact made it almost impossible for him to climb up on his own. He simply didn't have the strength. Carl couldn't give him any reassurance. but he said that he would do anything in his power to help. Carl leaned downward as far as he possibly could and tried to grab the chute below. He felt that his own limbs were on the edge of their stretching power, but with some luck, he managed to reach the edge of the man's chute. Would it be enough? He pulled upwards, but then something happened. A few loose boulders came tumbling down and nudged Carl in his back. It wasn't enough to send him tumbling off the cliff himself, but it was enough to make him jitter. The initial scare affected Carl's grip and the chute fell down again. He was back at his starting point, but then he got a great idea. The chute was simply too far down for him to reach the normal way, but using his belt as a device to hang from, he extended his reach just enough to get to the glider. The injured man looked up and saw the brave Carl inch closer. And that's when a miracle happened. Inspired by Carl's bravery, the glider sprung into action as well. He reached upwards with his hand to get to the hands of his rescuer, but the lines were still quite tangled. And they both agreed that they had to be fixed first. They started twisting and turning together. Together, they made quick work of the messed up wiring, and before they knew it, the glider was hanging in the correct position again. Carl reassured the man that help was on the way, but this last dangerous part they had to do together. They could already hear the sirens coming towards them. Looking down the mountainside, Carl and the paraglider saw the emergency service people arrive at the foot of the mountain. Maybe this was it. Maybe the man was saved and Carl could just simply talk calmly to him and wait for professionals to arrive. But today they weren't that lucky, because right before the emergency people started to make their climb, a huge gust of wind fell on the mountainside. The wind was so strong that it blew the entire chute off the mountain wall. The man was untangled, but the chute hit him hard enough on its way down for his grip to slip. This man fell and he thought he was a goner, but Carl was alert and grabbed the man's arm just in time. Using all the strength he still had left in his body, Carl pulled the injured paraglider onto the safe ledge he himself was on. Together, they watched the man's chute glide downwards. That could have been me. Thank you so much. I owe you my life, the glider said to Carl. While all of this was happening, the mountain emergency rescue team was still looking for the best way up the mountain. But even before they made it around the first corner, they heard a scream. But this wasn't a scream of desperation. This was a happy scream, because when the rescue team looked in front of them, they saw Carl approaching. He looked exhausted, but he managed to do the impossible, because on his back, he carried the injured paraglider. Take him to a hospital, he needs medical attention. Carl handed the injured paraglider over to the emergency team, who immediately brought the man to the nearest hospital. There, his leg was reset and the man's vitals were checked, and with the proper care, the man was healed in no time. Carl and his family tried to rejoin their vacation after that. The vacation was wonderful and otherwise uneventful after that. They just walked around and saw the raw, beautiful nature as intended. But there was one last surprise at the end. The glider, whose name was Jack, visited them at the end to hug them and thank them once more for saving his life.